Hello, and thanks for joining us tonight as we continue our study in the book of Isaiah. We had a live stream of our class tonight, but then there were some difficulties with that, and whenever I tried to go back and correct it, we wound up discarding the entire live stream broadcast. So I wanted to go back and make sure that you had a chance to look at Lesson 11 from our workbook, dealing with Hezekiah's dealing with Assyria and with Babylon, as Isaiah tells the story in Isaiah chapters 36 through 39. At this particular point, we're looking at some history that is also recorded back in the historical writings of the Old Testament. In question 1, it says, what passage is parallel to Isaiah 36 through 39? Well, you can find that parallel history given in 2 Kings chapters 18, 19, and 20. You can also find a recording of this in 2 Chronicles. So Isaiah lines up perfectly with what these historical records say, and we get to see it more from the eyes of Isaiah the prophet, who was there inside of the city. As we look to what happens here in chapter 36, we find that the Assyrians have sent ambassadors to Jerusalem with an army to back them up as they come to notify Jerusalem as to what was going to come. It says in verse 2, the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army, and he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. So he came for a meeting, and Hezekiah sent out to him Eliakim, Hilkiah's son, which was over his house, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah, Asaph's son, and the recorder. And they went out to meet with Rabshakeh to see what he had to say. Well, he begins very quickly to notify them of the doom of Jerusalem. He said in verse 4, say ye now to Hezekiah, thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, what confidence is this wherein thou trustest? I say, sayest thou, but we are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for war. Now on whom dost thou trust, that thou rebellest against me? Lo, thou trustest in the staff of that broken reed on Egypt. So what happens here is Rabshakeh is challenging him at the very first to say, have you put some alliance together with Egypt? They are but a broken reed. There's no power there in Egypt at all. And then he goes down to verse 7. He says, but if thou say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah hath taken away, and said to Judah and to Jerusalem, ye shall worship before this altar? He said, you can't trust Hezekiah. He destroyed all the idolatrous altars in the city. Now to Rabshakeh, that would have been an affront to these gods, and did not understand the one Jehovah God that Hezekiah worshiped. But he said, don't think that your God is going to be able to save you, because there have been other gods from other nations that the people trusted in, and we destroyed them over and over and over again. And he goes on to say, we'll even give you a gift if you'll go ahead and surrender. He said, we will give you 2,000 horses in verse 8, if you're able to put a set of riders upon them. He said, you probably don't even have a large enough army to ride on 2,000 horses. So we find here in this outline of what Rabshakeh is saying, is that he is speaking against God and blaspheming everything about God and simply bragging about what we're going to do. Well, these servants asked Rabshakeh to speak in the Syrian language, the language they commonly understood, because that would not be so inflammatory and possibly discouraging to the Jews who were up on the wall. Well, in defiance, Rabshakeh in verse 13 stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jewish language and said, hear ye the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. And he repeats the same idea. He repeats it so the city people will hear. Don't let Hezekiah deceive you, here in verses 14 and 15. He said, you need to go ahead and make peace with us, and we will let you get some food, we'll let you relax for a while, and then we'll transport you to another part of the empire, to a land that they basically say flows with milk and honey, and you will have everything that you need. Well, since when can you paint such a pretty picture of slavery? But nonetheless, that was the advantage that Rabshakeh was given, telling the people of Jerusalem, surrender, overrule Hezekiah, and then we won't be so hard on you. And then in verses 18 through 20, he simply once again blasphemes God. He says, beware lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Hath any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? It hasn't worked for anybody else. Why do you think it will work for you? So Rabshakeh is doing his best to demoralize the people of the city and to make them feel very small. Now, these ambassadors that Hezekiah sent didn't talk back to him. In verse 21, he says, but they held their peace and answered him not a word. For the king's commandment was, saying, answer him not. Hezekiah just told them, just don't give them any more ammunition. Don't give them anything else to make a big deal about. Just listen to what Rabshakeh has to say. So, in chapter 37 then, Hezekiah is somewhat beside himself over all of the things that have been spoken. In verse 1, it came to pass when King Hezekiah heard it, that he rent his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. And he sent the messengers to go get Isaiah and to bring him. And so that's what they did. And so whenever Isaiah comes to him, Isaiah is wanting him to be strong and to realize God is in control. But whenever he arrives in verse 3, then said they to him, thus saith Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble, and of rebuke, and of blaspheming. For the children are come to birth, and there is not strength to bring them forth. That was Hezekiah's summation of things, that this is a day of trouble. This is a day of rebuke. This is a day when we've had to listen to blaspheming, and we haven't got the strength to do anything about it. We are like a woman who is about to give birth to children, but she hasn't got the strength to do it. It's a terrible, terrible situation. Well, in verses 6 and 7 here of Isaiah chapter 37, Isaiah then begins to give encouraging words to Hezekiah. And Isaiah said unto them, thus say ye to your master, thus saith the Lord, be not afraid of the words that thou hast heard, words that thou hast heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor, and shall return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. So, Isaiah is giving the assurance through the messengers to Hezekiah that he does not need to be afraid. God will deliver his people. Well, rumor comes to the king that there is reinforcements coming from Ethiopia. We have no biblical reference to this other than what is recorded here. We find that in verse 9 that he heard a saying concerning Tahakah, the king of Ethiopia, that he has come forth to make war with thee. And when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah. Whenever the king found out that there might be reinforcements on the way, he wanted to get this defeat of Jerusalem over with quickly. So he sent Rabshakeh with a letter back to the king that once again outlined the very same arguments that he had made before. That God will not deliver Jerusalem. You will fall like all the other nations have fallen. Over in the chapter a little bit further down, he says in verse 10 of chapter 37, thus ye shall speak to Hezekiah the king of Judah, saying, let not thy God, in whom thou trustest, deceive thee, saying, Jerusalem shall be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, thou hast heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands, by destroying them utterly, and shalt thou be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them which my fathers have destroyed? He goes on to talk about many of his victories, and said, there is nobody that can stop us. So whenever this letter now is delivered to Hezekiah, in verse 14, it says, Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up into the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed unto the Lord. So Hezekiah takes this new document, the new set of threats from the king of Assyria. He takes that letter to the temple and he lays it on the floor before the altar and bows himself in prayer, begging God to, as he says in verse 17, incline thine ear, O Lord, and hear. Open thine eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to reproach the living God. And so God then, through Isaiah, gives an answer to Hezekiah. Going on down to verse 21, Hezekiah arrives there at the temple. And Hezekiah the son of Amos said unto Hezekiah, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, whereas thou hast prayed to me against Sennacherib the king of Assyria, this is the word which the Lord hath spoken concerning him. The virgin, the daughter of Zion, hath despised thee and laughed thee to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem hath shaken her head at thee, whom thou hast reproached and blasphemed, and against whom thou hast exalted thy voice and lifted up thine eyes on high, even against the Holy One of Israel. By thy servants hast thou reproached the Lord, and hast by the multitude of my chariots am I come up to the height of the mountains, to the sides of Lebanon. You bragged about all you're going to do, but I am going to destroy you. We find that God is going to defeat the nation of Assyria. In verse 29, because thy rage against me and thy tumult is come up unto mine ears, therefore I will put my hook in thy nose and my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back by the way which thou camest. And so here God is giving encouragement to Hezekiah that God's going to fight this battle, and God is going to defeat Assyria. In question 8, it then goes on, if we want to go ahead and fill in the details of what happened here from the historical record, Isaiah is giving this encouragement to Hezekiah, and that night God sends destruction amongst the Assyrian army. 185,000 soldiers die in the night. Sennacherib is his force is completely decimated, and so he then returns back home. And about just a few years after he returns back home, it says that so Sennacherib departed of Assyria and went and returned and dwelt in Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Niroch his god, that his son smote him with the sword, and then escaped into the land of Armenia, and one of his sons reigned in his stead. So Sennacherib did get disgraced. He realized if an Ethiopian army was coming, I better flee. He hurried back home. Now, in some of the historical records that we've found, indeed there is a stone that Sennacherib had carved out commemorating all of his victories. But whenever it talks about his adventures at Jerusalem, he simply says that he had Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. And that's all he said. Because after that, Sennacherib was defeated, and he was the one who had to go back home. Now in chapter 38, another part of Hezekiah's life is discussed. It says in verse 1, In those days was Hezekiah sick unto death. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, came to him, and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die, and not live. What does it mean to set thine house in order? Well, basically the thought is, you need to get ready to meet your God. Whatever details you need to put in place, anything that needs to be made right between you and another, or made right between you and your God, you need to take care of that. Set your house in order, because as Hezekiah is being told, you are going to die. Now we find that this sickness occurred some 11 years before the Assyrian invasion. whenever you look back to what the author did in his calculations here, he said that Hezekiah was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he continued to reign for 29 years, according to 2 Kings 18, verses 1 and 2. The 15 years added to his life would put this sickness in the 14th year of his reign. This would make Hezekiah 39 years old when he became sick. Thus the sickness occurred about 11 years before Sennacherib's invasion in 701. So in question 9 in our workbook, when did Hezekiah's sickness occur? It was about 11 years before this Assyrian invasion that we've been talking about. And in question 10, the way he computed that was, how old was Hezekiah when he was told that he would die? That would be 39. And how many years were added to his life? That was 15. Now we find that Hezekiah reacted to this news of his death by turning his face to the wall, and he prayed unto the Lord and said, Remember now, O Lord, I beseech thee, how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. And before Isaiah had even gotten out of his house, God said, I've heard Hezekiah's prayer, and I want you to go back up there to him, and I will make him well. He says, Go and say to Hezekiah, Thus saith the Lord, the God of David thy father, I've heard thy prayer, I've seen thy tears, and behold, I will add unto thy days 15 years. Prayer does make a difference. Hezekiah's prayer changed the plan of God, and through his providence he extended Hezekiah's life some 15 years more. But Hezekiah is not immune from shortcomings as well. And whenever word got out that Hezekiah had recovered from his sickness, it said that in verse 9, the writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, when he had been sick and recovered of his sickness, he goes to talk about how great God is. He praises God for what he has done. And the word of this gets all the way back to the nation of Babylon. And whenever Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, the king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he had heard that he'd been sick and was recovered. And so these men arrived, and Hezekiah, it says, was glad of them, and showed them the house of his precious things, the silver, the gold, and the spices, and the precious judgments, the precious ointments, and all the house of armor, and all that was found in his treasures. There was nothing in his house, nor in all his dominion, that Hezekiah showed not to them. What's going on here? Hezekiah, at least temporarily, is forgetting that all the good blessings that he has are blessings from God. And yes, this wealth that he has been given to him by God, but it's his wealth. It's the riches of his house. And so he, in his pride, shows everything to the Babylonians. And God is sore displeased with this action of pride, and we find that Isaiah then comes to rebuke him for what he has done. In verse 5, continuing of Isaiah 39, Then said Isaiah to Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, thy days come, that all that is in thine house, that which thy fathers have laid up in store until this day, shall be carried to Babylon, and nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. So we find that Hezekiah regrets the braggadocious way in which he has treated the people of Babylon. But Isaiah goes on to tell him that these things will not happen during your lifetime. But in the lifetime of your sons, it will be the Babylonians that come and destroy Jerusalem and carry all of his wealth away. In verse 8, Then said Hezekiah to Isaiah, Good is the word of the Lord which thou hast spoken. He said, Moreover, for there shall be peace and truth in my days. So Hezekiah was thankful that he would get to finish out his lifetime and be okay. But he also realizes the consequences of what he has done. So whenever Isaiah comes to Hezekiah. He asks him in verse 4, "What have they seen in thine house?" And Hezekiah answered, "All that is in mine house have they seen. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not showed them." Here we see the evidence of Hezekiah's pride. We may take that same question and ask ourselves, what are we proud of? Don't we sometimes walk in those same steps? We're anxious to show off the new house that we own, the new car that we bought, the other blessings that we have. And sometimes we forget to include the fact that we only have those blessings because of the goodness of God. Yes, we may have used our abilities, but those were God-given abilities. Yes, we had the opportunity to make significant money, but God provided those opportunities. As Paul told us in Acts 17, it's in God that we live and move and have our being. We might look at this question from another point of view as to what did those ambassadors see? What has the world seen out of you, Hezekiah? And the world could ask that same question of us. What has the world seen out of us? Have they seen us practicing righteousness? Have they seen us as godly servants that are trying to do our very best to serve the living God? Or indeed, have they seen us acting just like all the rest of the world? What have they seen in thy house is a powerful question to consider. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our study here tonight in the book of Isaiah, looking at lesson 11 out of our workbook as we've looked at chapters 36, 37, 38, and 39 in this center section of the book of Isaiah. And we'll be continuing our study next week, Lord willing, and we hope that you will join us then.